Greetings, compadres. This is an exciting day because today we have Janice Johnson Dowd. And here's the thing. She has a lot of things that she does. She is an MLSW social worker. So she's a licensed, is it a medical social worker or
a licensed master?
Licensed master social worker. Okay, so can't wait to hear about that. She's also a recovering alcoholic. She's a mother of 4, and she has combined her personal and professional experience to write a book that guides recovering individuals on how to repair relationships that they damaged in active addiction. So this is awesome. What a wonderful opportunity. I know a lot of my listeners have those relationships. And I can even think of somebody right now in my life who is having a little bit of fear around making amends to some nephews in her life. And so, this is kind of what happens. And a lot of us find ourselves a little bit rudderless when we're doing the work to repair those relationships. So, Janice, it's an absolute treat to have you here today. And I'm so excited. But before I jump in, I just got to read to you really quick, you guys, you listeners, about what she's been doing. She's got this very cool background. Her education and research experience began in undergraduate and graduate studies at the University of Michigan. Woo! And the University of Texas, where she worked as a teaching assistant and research assistant. I admire research assistants. It's a lot of details for me to take care of. So I think it's wonderful. And then her master's thesis was titled, wait for it, Alcoholism, PTSD, and the Vietnam Veteran. Wow. So she has worked in the employee assistance programs, and she's done inpatient and outpatient treatment settings, including a whole bunch of different like Army medical centers, and she's done all kinds of things. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let her begin to unpack her story and just tell us as much or as little as she would like to tell us about her background and how she got to be doing the fantastic work that she's doing today. So, Janice, I welcome you and I honor your presence here today. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me and for that beautiful introduction. I really appreciate that. And I have to say that I love the opportunity to talk about my topic of helping addicts and alcoholics repair their relationships. Because despite being a social worker and all that training and research, when I began drinking and entered treatment, I did almost as much damage to my relationships with my family, especially my kids, in early recovery as I did in active addiction. And I wasn't able to recognize it until I was about 6 months sober. But that's jumping ahead. I'm happy to try to do a Reader's Digest version of my drinking history, because I think it helps pull it together on why I became a social worker and why I love research and writing. But so I was a late in life drinker. I didn't really start drinking until my 40s. And that was primarily for 3 reasons. First, I grew up in an alcoholic home. My parents had good intentions. They definitely did better than their parents. But I realized really early on that we were different and that I was wounded from it. I decided as a youth, probably a teenager, that I was interested in helping others, and that I wanted to make sure I never did to my kids what my parents did to me. So also being raised in an alcoholic home, I emerged the classic adult child of an alcoholic. Insecure, low self-esteem, desperate for attention and affection and reassurance. and most of all, controlling. So, which I still struggle with some today. But as a young person, when I experimented with alcohol and drugs, I didn't like, because of the controlling aspect of myself, I didn't like that feeling of being numbed,
Mm.
or it didn't give me any kind of relief. So I experimented a little bit with marijuana, and that just made me more nervous and anxious. And so for a codependent, that was not a great place to be. So instead, I put all my energy into sports and athletics,
Mm.
and was thankfully fairly good at that. When I look back at that now, I would say I probably approached, because I was a synchronized swimmer, also known as artistic swimming, which
Wow.
it was, yeah, it's a great sport. It's very difficult. And it required a lot of cross training and things like that. So I was able to, escape my family life, build a little self-esteem by participating in the sport. You had automatic friends. People judged you on your effort and not on your background, who your parents were, things like that. In fact, that's one of the great things that my mom did. I mean, my parents are good people. They just made mistakes, but my mom was always the team manager.
Mm.
So, which I think is an important thing to point out to anyone who's working on their adult children of alcoholic issues. Um, there is a lot of good even mixed in with the bad, and so I'm able to take the good, what I learned from my parents, and I've learned to let go of some of that bad. But anyhow, swimming was my savior. Um, I had some great coaches and some other female leaders who helped guide me. And I earned a college scholarship. And so I love to say that was my socially acceptable way of running away from home.
Mm.
I grew up in Texas. I went to school in Michigan, about as far as you could go. And there, my parents, it's a long story, but my parents didn't give me any guidance on what to study or do. They were like, you'll probably meet a nice man, so just get a degree. So I took the classes I enjoyed, and that's why I got involved in research. I volunteered for studies and working with PhD students, and I just loved that. And so I naturally was drawn to social work. Left Michigan, graduated from Michigan, went to Texas, straight to graduate school. And then from that, still did. Of course, I had to work my way through graduate school, so I had to work. But got more great experience and stepped right into, I spent my 20s working in the addiction field as a social worker. The good thing about that is that all that close contact with my professors and my mentors really instilled in me self-care. You got to take care of yourself. You can't be a good social worker, therapist, marriage therapist unless you're doing therapy yourself.
Mhm.
So in my 20s, I participated in Al-Anon and ACA and did different periods therapy. And I was headed in the right direction.
Mhm.
Towards the end of my 20s, I met my husband, and we pretty quick started on a family. And I can't imagine how you have managed 8 children. Um, because 4 children, I love my kids. I am so grateful for them. And up to pregnancy 4, I was like, I'll have as many as God gives me. But you lose a lot of yourself, don't you think, as being a parent?
Yep, absolutely.
So I now also my now ex-husband, he traveled a great deal at work. So I really feel like I was, a single mom 4 days a week, trying to raise my kids, trying to work part-time, feeling like I was failing at it all, not doing any self-care, and just plugging away, from one activity to the next. And yeah, it was hard. So once I stopped being pregnant and breastfeeding, because that kept me sober all my 30s, I started to drink socially at first. And I'm not blaming anything on like the mommy wine culture, but that's absolutely how I started. Like there was no time to go out and run 6 miles every morning anymore, unless you got up at 4 a.m. So denial was high, and I slipped into the habit of having wine at lunch with my girlfriends, maybe wine while we're watching The Bachelor or making dinner. And over the course of my 40s, my drinking just increased. It increased classic, slowly, gradually. And life happens. We have stressors that come up. A particularly hard thing that happened for me was when my dad died. And that just set me on a tailspin. I took care of both of my parents one summer. They were both very ill. And I started day drinking by myself. And I mean, I believe I've always been an alcoholic or addict. I just had socially acceptable addictions as a young woman, with focusing on career and parenting or running. But that definitely, I can look back at that and go, I remember sitting at my dad's bedside with vodka poured into my Diet Coke to get me through, the day. And I'm not proud of it. I'm not excusing it. It's what I did. And I became a full-blown alcoholic towards the end of my 40s. So classic, like problems are now arising from the alcohol, not just stressors in life or fights or, difficulty juggling schedules. The alcohol started creating the problems. And being a good alcoholic and lots of denial, I resisted for a while. I thought, okay, I'm a social worker. I know what'll fix me. I'll go to therapy again. I haven't been to therapy since my 20s. I will try and start running again, get into fitness. I will. And when that didn't work, I talked with I'm very blessed. This is a side note. You may want to edit this out, but the same physician delivered all 4 of my children. So having known her for like, oh my God, 20 years, it was very easy for me to call her up and go, I'm struggling. I think I need an antidepressant, or I'm struggling with all this anxiety things. And it was easy for me to manipulate my physicians into prescribing me pills, which of course didn't work because my main problem was alcohol. So, to make a long story short, I finally started going to AA. And a big part of my story is the guilt and shame that I have about having been a professional working in this field, helping other people, and then succumbing to the disease, which I want to point out is just a great example about how alcoholism is cunning, baffling, confusing. And for me, the only way to manage this disease is to not drink at all and to come to terms with I'm powerless and unmanageable over it. So I started going to AA. In fact, my AA birth date is November 14th, 2012. And I made easily out of the next 90 days, probably 70 meetings. I just loved it. I knew I found my home, but I was still so controlling. I was going to work the program my way. And I love that AA welcomes you back if you relapse, but I definitely abused that. So I'd be like, I'm going to drink this Sunday afternoon and I'll just pick up a silver chip on Monday. I don't know if you ever did that, but I know I'm not the only one.
No.
So to make a long story short with that is that I wasn't able to stay sober with AA alone. And ultimately I had a bad drinking blowout during Mardi Gras, and my best friend and family did like a mini intervention, and I went to treatment. I went to treatment thinking, I know what this is about. I'm going to be a good patient. It's going to be 4 weeks long, and I will come home and our family life we'll struggle some, but we'll get through it. I'm like, this is what's going to happen. But this is where I really started making mistakes. And I look back and I think a lot of people do the same thing. I went to treatment and I embraced it. I actually loved the opportunity to like have all my responsibilities taken from me and being able to focus on myself. But I embraced that so much that I put a wall up between me and my family. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely.
And it didn't help that the treatment center was about 200 miles away from my home. That made it difficult for my husband and kids to come see me. All 4 kids were in activities, very busy lifestyle. And again, I almost took advantage of that. I knew, and I excused them. I'm like, oh, you don't have to come. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And really what that was about was my guilt and shame and my fear of rejection, which also comes from my childhood. It was easier for me to distance them and pretend like everything was going to be fine than to actually make the effort. So if any of my kids were here right now, they would be like, oh yeah, we did not know what was going on with mom. Dad did not do a good job of explaining to us. He did get them into counseling and all of that was great, but they were just left in limbo. So their life went from having an inconsistent mom who's actively drinking to a mom who's very inconsistent, unpredictable, because she's at this treatment center and she seems just as superficial and dismissive as ever. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So, and looking back, I can attribute some of this to, I'm sure you remember this too. You take away alcohol and the problems are still there. But so the problems, the feelings, all of that seems magnified because you don't have the coping mechanisms. You're learning new coping mechanisms, but they're not natural yet. And so for me, I can look back and see this now that I fell back on those coping mechanisms that I had as a kid in my family. Dismissing the problem, pretending like everything's fine. I mean, this is how like my parents would be bickering, having a fight. The phone would ring and my mom would pick it up and be like, hello, the classic, everything's fine in our house. Don't tell the neighbors what's going on, all of that. So I fell back on that too with my kids, and being superficial and being that cute little trying to be, not literally, but falling back on that. If I can sing and dance and entertain them enough, everything's going to be okay. If I can distract from the real problem. And the real problem was that I was just so afraid of them rejecting me. Right. Some of that threat was real, and that I knew that if I didn't get my act together, my now ex-husband would leave me and limit my ability to be with my kids. So he would take my kids from me. Probably rightfully so, if I remained in active addiction, I don't like to admit it, but I did drive with them while I was drinking in the car. I never got caught, never got a DUI. Part of that was because one of my sons during that last year had his learner's permit, so he'd drive us everywhere and relieve me of some of the burden and some of the risk. But anyhow, straight to the point, I made a lot of mistakes in early sobriety. And I'm not alone in that.
Not at all.
No, I made mistakes and I continued to hurt my kids. My 4 weeks, this did not help either, but it helped my sobriety. I really embraced learning the skills and the tools to get and stay sober. My treatment, so when I got to treatment, 4 weeks actually evolved into 12 because all of that stuff that I had sucked up for like 15 years from working on myself in my 20s to now being 50, you know, I let all that out. And they kept saying to me in the treatment, it was a great facility that I went to. They're like, we think you should stay a couple more weeks. We think that the triggers, because I finally dealt with the loss of my dad and the guilt feelings I had about that. So they're like, stay 2 more weeks, stay 2 more weeks. And you know what? At first, I involved my family on that decision, but after the like second extension, I was like, I'm just staying. And I left my kids hanging, you know, and they didn't understand why I was staying so long. And our relationships started to get painfully obvious that they were not good. So at the end of the 12 weeks, the treatment recommendation was to go to a halfway house. So I went from 4 weeks of treatment to 12 weeks to almost 3 months in a halfway house. And then that evolved into another year in a sober living home. So I was away from my family a lot in the first year. And I think I've talked way too much about how I got there. But the thing that happened that I think was pivotal to my finally recognizing that I needed to work on my relationships with my kids was when I got kicked out of my halfway house. I was pushing 6 months sober. I won't go into the fine details, but I got kicked out for something I didn't do. And it was such a shocker because here I was, one of the older women at the halfway house, kind of a mom figure to the 20 somethings and 30 something girls who were there. And I thought I was like the model patient, the model client, because again, I'm people pleasing, all of that stuff. I'm going to go along with the rules. So getting thrown out was earth shattering. And it lined up with, it happened just days after I'd had like my first marriage counseling appointment with my now ex in months. And he had made it clear during that appointment that I wasn't welcome home. So when I got kicked out, I was destroyed because I thought, I can't let him know. I can't go home. If I let him know, he might use this against me and take my kids from me. So and when you get kicked out, you literally like, we're helping you pack and thankfully I had a vehicle there. We're putting the stuff in your car. See ya.
Wow.
So the girls had kind of become my surrogate family. I'd replaced my kids with these women and they were not allowed to talk to me. So I really only had, I like to kind of call it, I told my boss one day, I kind of went from housewife to homeless, but just not absolutely true. My sponsor let me sleep in her guest bedroom while I figured out the next step. But I certainly felt homeless and all alone. It was a tough time. So it took me down a path of a really deep, dark depression because while I was sleeping in my sponsors, she said, I give you a week and that's it. Good, tough love. I had great sponsors. This woman is still my sponsor and I adore her. She's like, do this. And although I was alone, I'd been very active in the 12-step community. So, and I've been going to meetings every day. So I need help getting into another halfway house. And then I got rejected over and over again. Halfway houses. And it was really shocking until I found the living situation than I did in a sober living home, so it was devastating at the time. I was deeply depressed. I did not want to continue to hurt my kids by killing myself, but I was at that point where it looked hopeless. Here I'd worked so hard on my sobriety. I was sober, and I stayed sober through this too, which I think is huge.
Mhm.
But it hadn't paid off. You know what I mean? Okay, here's the catch. I was still blaming other people and things for my bad relationship with my family. I
Mm.
wasn't taking responsibility. And this event was instrumental in waking me up and seeing that I had taken them for granted. I'd made a lot of mistakes. I dismissed their feelings. I hadn't involved them in my decisions. And so at 6 months sober, I started to try and work on my relationships with my kids. It took another year before I could see improvement with any of my kids.
Mm.
And that was very painful, but I fell back on my 12-step community. I had a part-time job where I was living, so I used their social support too to not feel so alone. And I did everything I could, fell back on my research experience, my writing experience, read everything I could, refreshed. My therapist and I finally, because when I first got out of treatment too, I was like, I don't want to deal with any of that family of origin stuff. I've been doing that for 12 weeks. Let's just focus on getting me sober. So she was like, now we have to deal with it
Mm.
because all of those issues that you've not addressed are impacting your parenting skills with your kids. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So I went back, took therapy, um, in a whole new direction, got involved in a therapy group that was specifically for women who were raised in dysfunctional families and addressing those issues. Probably the most important thing I did, though, was to reach out to, and I know you go to a lot of AA meetings. So whenever there was an opportunity to, or, for like when they go, okay, I don't have a presentation today. Does anyone have a topic they'd like to talk about? I'd be like, I want to know how to repair relationships with my kids.
Love
And
it.
so I reached out to my 12-step community, pulled people aside, um, asked what they did right, what they did wrong, what could I do. I even reached out to some of my friends' children.
Mm.
One of my closest friends from treatment, she had two boys about the age of my youngest two boys, and I met with them, and they were extremely helpful. Her experience with her boys had been much different. They had welcomed her back with open arms, but there had been struggles, along the way.
Oh, yeah.
And so I learned, I basically did the paperwork research, asked for help, did the therapy, and eventually it all started working out.
Mhm.
So which kind of brings me to the book. When I was getting to the other side of it, then, because I'm very involved in service work, more on I do sponsor one person. I prefer public speaking and sharing my story, things like that. So whenever offered the opportunity to give a presentation at a workshop or return to the treatment center, my topic was always family reconciliation. It was
Mm.
always that, because that was what my passion was. And that just essentially evolved into the book. And so the book is written for anyone. Well, the book is the book that I wish I'd had when I had entered treatment,
Mm.
you know? And it's written for anyone who's at any stage of recovery from addiction, alcoholism, some behavior, even some mental illness, on how some tools and tips, even a little disease concept explanation of the brain and the body's reaction, some relapse prevention. But it's written for anyone in recovery who's struggling to repair the relationships with their kids and or their family or their friends, or partners. So it was really born out of my experience. And the nice thing for me, not to sound too cliche, is that really this all came full circle for me. As a 24-year-old social worker, fresh out of school, I wanted more than anything to help families repair and break the cycle of generational trauma. And finally, I did it on a one-to-one kind of basis as a young woman. But now, I get the opportunity, like being invited to speak on this podcast and other podcasts. I can reach so many more people. It's kind of a miracle. It's one of those God wink things that, it's meant to be. I've always loved writing, but most of the time I've done writing and research for other people. And finally I've done it for myself. And it's been great fun. So,
Janice, you're amazing. Thank you for sharing all this, because here's what I loved. I loved your whole story. I related to so many things. I have like all these notes that I wrote down that I wanted to ask you about, and I'll try and not dominate this conversation, but I love that you started out as a social worker. And then obviously I don't love that you had to go through all of the pain and experiences that you had to go through, but there's something different I find about the head knowledge, right? Versus the now I'm boots on ground, like I've been there kind of thing, where, you've had the experience of healing the relationships with your kids. And that's like a whole nother level of empathy. It's like you can really get your clients on a way that a lot of people can't, so I just think that's huge, and I think it's beautiful. And I know that this is such a common thing. I love that you kept saying fear of rejection, fear of rejection. And it's like, yeah, like, if I ever reach emotional sobriety, like it's this lofty peak thing out there, I can practice emotional sobriety. I don't think I'm ever really there. Sometimes I get a glimpse, like a glimpse of it, but that's what I picture it kind of is for me, is truly losing that fear of rejection. Because deep down inside, there is a huge part of me that still can feel like that 14-year-old girl who I once was, who is like, oh, well, why are you stonewalling me? Or why are you rejecting me after I thought we were really close? Did I misread that? Like, I can still do all of that ruminating. And it gets better, as the more meetings I go to and the more work I do on it and spirituality and all of that. But I'll get right back there if my level of fatigue is a certain way, or if I'm just kind of, not feeling it in my own skin today or whatever it is. So I totally related to that. And I'm wondering, how did you do it? How did you, like, what were the ages? You said your son he had his learner's permit for driving. So then what were the ages of your kids when you went to treatment? And then there was sort of that year afterwards, right? Where you were in the different homes.
Right. So, I had a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, 8th grader, and 10th or 11th grader, and then 2 college students who were 20 and 21. I'm sure you do this too, having 8 kids. You have to think about their ages.
Totally.
But
Yeah.
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 And just as a side note, like I recently had my birthday and two of my kids were at the house and we were talking about it. And one of my children said, yeah, those were the trauma years. And I was like, what? He goes, trauma, drama, whatever you want to call it. And he wasn't talking about when my active addiction. He was talking about those first couple of years of my sobriety when I wasn't home and how his world had been upended
Mm-hmm.
and confused. So, yeah,
Mm.
they were young.
They,
And to me, they're young.
mhm,
Uh, they all had kind of different experiences with me in active addiction.
mhm,
So the 15-year-old was probably the most, I haven't even really said this out loud, probably the most enabling of me and codependent. But he was also the one who healed first because he was the most verbal about, you're a screw up. I mean, he didn't say that, but I mean, I love this story. When you go to treatment or the treatment facility I was at, they offered the family members an opportunity to write an impact letter
mhm.
about how your addiction impacted them. And he's the only one of my children who wrote it. It was bone crushingly painful. I had to read it in front of my group, aloud, not make excuses or explain along the way.
Ugh,
I have
yeah.
no idea how long it took, but by the end, everyone in the group was crying. Um, and of course, this was really traditional group therapy where they're like not allowed to hand you a Kleenex or a napkin.
Okay.
And but this is a God thing too. And I'm a little off course, but I just want to share this story. There was a young man who was somewhere between 19 and 21 who wasn't a normal member of our group, but he was there that day because his therapist was doing something. And his mother, so he had a problem with alcohol or drugs. I'd never really seen him before that day. Um, but his mother had recently died from alcoholism. So this young man lost it. And the feedback he gave me was tremendous because it was like my son was there telling me about how he was impacted by his mother's drinking. And my therapist was great. She let us hug when it was all over and we just held each other and sobbed. And it was a great, almost like, being kicked out of the treatment center. It was a great learning lesson. And that was one step that I did right early in treatment is that I learned or I began to accept just how badly I'd hurt my kids with my drinking. Up
Mm.
until then, I was still kind of in denial because I was mostly a stay-at-home drinker late at night. So I was in denial, but to see how this young man had been impacted and his mother had died,
Mm.
and then my son's letter had said things like, you don't know how many times that I laid in bed at night crying, not knowing if you would be alive in the next morning. You know what I mean? I was just, it was a miracle experience. So, but back to your question, my kids were all ages of adolescence. I think the most important thing that I learned to do with them and that I share when I give talks is that you have to honor those kids' feelings, their experiences, um, their impression of what happened. Maybe not the same impression you remember of of an event, but you have to honor that and believe them and trust them.
Mhm.
Their experience is their experience. So yeah, and the one, okay, did I say this already? That it took me 4 years before I could say I really felt like I had reached all four children.
Mm.
Yeah, and there's lots of dynamics why, but I want to make sure I mention that because, I want to give hope to other people
Mhm.
that it might be years, but my relationship with all four of my kids today is mind-blowingly good.
Mm.
Things come up, My child said that to me the other night, the trauma years. And instead of seeing that, at one point I would have taken this like a kick in the gut, like, oh, one more win. But no, instead I took it as an opportunity to make amends. Amends for something that I had not done before because I hadn't realized how painful that had been. I feel like I'm preaching now, but I'm just
No,
very passionate about, um, that there's hope and that you can
yeah,
repair relationships. And I know when I go to meetings, and a couple months ago, there was a man who's like, Christmas, I mean, this is right before Christmas. He was like, I haven't talked to any of my family members since Christmas 8 years ago. And just last week, my estranged wife called me from treatment. But he was still in this mindset, like, I'll never get back together with all my family members. And I wanted to just go, I have an idea too,
yeah,
talk to me, call me, and I'll at least give you the hope that it can happen. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's so important too, because it's like sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly, right? And I remember being in meetings, and I still will occasionally be in a meeting where somebody says something to the effect of, and my kids have never seen me drunk. And it's like, for some reason, that kind of used to just really feel like a pinprick, just like, oh man, I wish that was me.
Yeah.
And my first four kids were quite a bit younger um, than yours when I was in my cups, but I got a DUI with them in the car, and they remember that for
Mm-hmm.
sure, right? And they remember being picked up by the neighbor. And I mean, it was like something out of a movie, not good. So
Mm-hmm.
they remember that. Um, and I think that, and it's interesting because then my second four haven't seen me drink. And it's this weird thing though, because it's almost like when I talk about the person who I used to be in my disease, in my full blown alcoholism, it's almost like I'm talking about somebody different that
Mm-hmm.
isn't me. And while I know that that to an extent is true because I've done the work and I'm not that person anymore and I don't do those behaviors anymore. Um, for me, obviously, it's very fresh in my older four because I like to keep my story fresh,
Mm-hmm.
And as time goes on and it starts to fade, I just kind of go, okay, wait. No, dig out everything you've written about it. Remember why, and not that I want to beat myself up, but just remember, oh, that was a horrible time, such a
Right.
place of pain. Um, and so my kids have had such different experiences. And my first four, I related to so much of what you said because, like, I mean, I wanted to just hit the pause button, and I did go away to treatment twice. Um, but I just wanted to get better and then just come back and be like, hey guys, I'm back. Is everybody so happy to see me? Yay! Let's just resume our life. And that was not at all how it happened. Now, my
Mm-hmm.
kids were young enough that they were thrilled to have me back and not drinking. But I mean, we had to get to know each other. I didn't know who I was
Right.
because I was like, I had lost my identity in motherhood. You touched on that at the beginning. And so I kind of didn't even know who I was as a person, like just as Amy, not as mom and wife. And so I had to kind of just strip everything down and just kind of just go, I don't really know. Like, let's just take this one day at a time and figure out who I am now. But I mean, they had to watch me go get UAs. I was on probation. I had legal issues. So I had to go to court a few times. Like, so they saw all that and they saw me kind of walk through those fears and just kind of, and it wasn't pretty. I mean, I wasn't like, oh, this is kind of hard, but it's going to be fine. Like, no, I mean, I was like talking crazy things like, if I go to jail, are you guys going to come visit me? And what am I like? I mean, I was like upside down, right? And so they watched me and they accompanied me. Like they walked beside me as I went through that. And kind of, I mean, it was weird and uncomfortable for everybody. But now, kind of on the other side of it, in terms of it's been next almost 13 years that I've been sober, those older four are like, no, that's what we needed. We needed to see you recover out loud. We couldn't have you like have this DUI and all this drama, and then you go away and you come back and you're all like, hey guys, like
Yeah.
that would have been so disrespectful, inappropriate,
Mhm.
unfeeling. Yeah. And so it's an interesting thing to watch people process their own experience and their own situation in their own way. And I'm curious to know, how did you start the process of healing with your kids? Did you I mean, I did formal amends with my kids, but they were really little still. I don't know if they got it. They remember it. Three of them do. But they're like, yeah, like that didn't really, it was more that I lived differently that they
Mhm.
cared about.
Right.
But how did you start? Did you take them to coffee? Did you just kind of start sharing?
No, you know what? I think I started by making more efforts to come home and just being present, just being there. I mean, and I say this all the time, it's not the big efforts, it's the little efforts. It's being
Yes.
like, oh, wait, I'm going to put my phone down and I'm going to listen to what you have to say.
Mhm.
It's those little things that add up slowly. Um, but the bigger things is like, offering them the opportunity to speak, or when the opportunity came up, because each child was a little bit different. And one of the things that I found is that if you're doing an activity or something else together, somehow those opportunities to share or to make an amends just comes naturally,
Yes.
so grabbing those little God wink moments
Mhm.
and going with it. Another example. So my middle son, last time he's an adult now, he was home. Because we're all human, and I wish I could say I was a neat freak, but I do kind of freak out when everything's cluttered.
Huh?
And it was like 8 o'clock at night or something, and I started barking orders like, please throw your water bottles in the there's like 6 water bottles on the coffee table.
Yeah.
And I started barking orders, and my son grabbed me. He was like, you're triggering me, Mom. And at
Oh.
first I got defensive,
Uh-huh.
of course. I mean, I'm only human. But then
Right.
I was like, what do you mean? He goes, you used to do this. When you were drinking at night, you would get pissed off about some mess and you'd start barking orders,
Mhm.
and you're triggering me. I'm feeling that same anxiety that I had back then, which was a great opportunity for me to make an amends about it,
Mm.
to go, oh, I hear you. I remember that too.
Mhm.
And I am sorry.
Mhm.
Is there anything I can do? And of course, was a good 10 years since it happened, which
Mm.
shows how we're affected by the wounds. Our wounds from our childhood stay with us.
Mhm.
That's why you got to address them. But it also is an opportunity to heal another wound with him. And
Mhm.
one of the things I always like to say too, and I'm sure you can relate to this because of your experience being a mom who's got long-term recovery now, that my pride over living through and surviving my disease outweighs the guilt and shame that I had.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's
So
well said.
it was not an easy lesson to learn. I drug my feet in therapy many times, like, because they would say to me, no, you're setting a good example. And I'd be like, I'm a horrible mother. I wounded them forever. I did exactly to my kids what my parents did to me. The
Mm-hmm.
thing I swore I wouldn't do. And but I got sober.
Mm-hmm.
I turned it around. And I
Absolutely.
hopefully am demonstrating to my kids that whatever happens in their lives, they'll be able to cope with it.
I love it. And that it's not easy. Like it's not an easy linear path. Like,
Mm-mm.
oh, this is how you get from A to Z. Like you just follow this map. But it's like, no, this is a rocky road with lots of turns and like, this is not like for the faint of heart, I mean,
Mhm.
there are some things that, you have to hear from different family members that are like, okay,
Right.
and I love that you mentioned not being defensive, and that is hard. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is to want to take, oh, whatever it was, take it personally and and it's hard to just I love you also said something about, honoring their experience and how they experienced and perceived something, right?
Mhm.
And that's a tough one too. And I mean, you touched on the whole idea just now, like the organic amends. Those are like gold, I mean, I find when those opportunities come up, and they will still come up, that I will just make an amends to one of my kids for something kind of recent, actually. It's
Mhm.
not even, but just that. I mean, you and I think, are from similar generations, and that wasn't really practiced with our
Yeah.
parents' generation. It was kind of like, do as I say, not as I do, and their generation before them was even more so. And so, um, it's never fun to kind of break the chain and be the one, right? That's kind of like, hi, now I'm gonna show you all my flaws. But but it's so worth it. It's so healthy. It's so important because, the alternative then is like trying to be this fake person. I mean, I tell my kids all the time, I'm like, I'm afraid I'm gonna wake up one of these days and you guys are gonna be like, hey, we found out you don't know what you're doing. It's like, let me just tell you right now, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm just a person. I'm like learning how to parent a 23-year-old, and I don't know, I'm just winging it. But that's why it's important to keep these connections and communication channels open, you
Mhm.
know, so that you could tell me what it is that you're feeling, and expose me to more of who you are. And I should be so lucky that I get that opportunity. It's a blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, I will never stop going to meetings or going to therapy. It's progress. There's always room. And
Mm,
that's not a bad thing. It's not saying I'm broken. It's just saying that I want to keep learning, you know, I
I
want
love
to
it.
improve. Yeah.
Janice, tell us about your book as we start to wrap up, like where to find it.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I mean, if people want to follow you, where do they do that?
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity.
Of
Well,
course.
my Instagram site is parenting underscore the word IN underscore recovery. My website is www.janicejonsondowd.com, which I'm in the process of updating and adding a blog to it because I get all these great ideas. Um, and it has links to the podcast. So I'll add this link once the podcast is published to it, and it'll have more information about the book. So I have gone the traditional route with the book and seeking an agent and a publisher, and that slows down the process a little bit.
Mm.
However, I'm thrilled with having this amount of assistance because I am very coachable. And so the book won't be released until spring of 2025, which
Okay.
seems like a long time, but it has to go through several steps. We're doing the final edits on it now, and I'm just excited. So I'll have information, of course, about that on my website and Instagram. Yeah.
That is fantastic. Congratulations to you. That
Thank you.
is so wonderful. And what I love is that this excites me. I know you already have helped so many people, but this is going to continue. Like it's just going to snowball for you. And I love that. And the other thing that I love that I have to mention before like we close up is I love that you said that, you know, when you were given opportunities to be of service. So, for example, in those meetings, when they didn't have somebody to lead it or pick a topic, you would put your hand up and go, all right, I got a topic. And this is it. I want to know how you guys are, you know, healing your relationships and sobriety. And because that's what it is. It's like, you know, they say, you know, I came for my drinking and I stay for my thinking, right? Like, it's like, how
Right.
do I handle my life as a sober person? How do I
Right.
do this thing, right? And I love that because you asked for help. And it's like, that posturing alone to have that, you know, seeking heart and to be that person who is the lifelong learner, that's magic right there. It
Mhm.
is magic because that's where, you know, we can really open ourselves up to like, oh, yeah, I didn't think about it that way. Or that's an interesting thing. You know, that person was able to, you know, repair this by doing that. And it's just you know, once we connect and we share those dark parts, it's like they're exposed to the light and then we get to share that light with others. And this is exactly what you've done today. So I want to thank you for being here.
Well,
And
I appreciate that. I think your wisdom is amazing too.
you're so kind. That's so
You're
nice. Um, Everything that I ever learn, I swear, I have learned from somebody else by doing
right.
the same thing, you know, by just going, how did you do this? Like somebody help. I don't know, you know. So I loved this time with you. And as I close, I just want to say that you said being present was how you started to heal those relationships. Like that is so key. Just
Mm.
being present. I mean, the possibilities are almost endless once you've shown up, right? Just show
Right.
up and not expecting like these great, you know, big magical things. And all of a sudden we're going to have this movie ending and all of this stuff. And it's like, just being there.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah.
Janice, I wish you all the best. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. I can't wait to continue to watch you rise. This is exciting. And if you are listening, be sure to follow Janice, okay? And then also remember to be kind, rewind. Thank you for the honor of your time. Take what you like and leave the rest behind.